Thanks very much, Matthew. We're just negotiating times there. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Tom Lumpkin and the whole of the CIMMIT team, Matthew himself, Dr. Brown, and also Petra for organising my travel and getting me here at short notice. It's interesting for me to be in the Yaqui Valley because the very first experiments that Richard Richards did, where we checked out this phenomenon that Matthew mentioned, the showing that you could measure water use efficiency, genetic differences using carbon isotope discrimination. One of the genotypes that we used was Yaqui 50E, so it was interesting to me to be in the valley. But I'm not going to talk about that today. No physiology really. It's going to be about climate change. Well, there are many aspects. What should we look at first? Well, I think we should make the point that the greenhouse effect is a radiation imbalance. And the diagrams there are three diagrams. The top one is for the globe, the middle one is for the ocean, and the bottom one is for land. The left-hand side shows the increase in long-wave radiation coming in, and here's the outgoing fluxes, and you can see that nearly all the extra radiation that comes in because of the trapping of greenhouse gases is actually lost as long wave going out. So most of what comes in goes out, but there's a small amount left over for an increase in LE, that's latent heat of evaporation, so that's evaporation, and delta H is the sensible heat. Now, in this audience, of course, we're mostly interested in the land base, and so you can see that once again, the big increase in downwelling long-wave radiation from the greenhouse gases is almost totally matched by a big increase in long-wave radiation going out. Now, to get an increase in long-wave radiation going out, you have to increase the temperature, and that can for black-body radiation. And so once again, you're left with rather small changes in the fluxes of water vapor and heat. I should say that these data, or they're results of models, and it's in a paper led by my colleague Mike Roderick, which was accepted for publication this week. Well, as we just heard, water is the greatest single limitation to wheat production, and so I'd like to jump straight to things that affect water. He said putting down the water bottle. And in this study that Mike led, we examined a multi-model ensemble. It's about 39 runs from 20 different climate models. Now in this table here we get the overall view of what happens to the major fluxes. So you can see that precipitation at the global level is about a metre a year, 1,045 millimetres, and precipitation and evaporation must balance for the globe as a whole. And the increase for that 100-year period is predicted to be about 47 millimetres per year, and balanced by an increased evaporation. Because of the global scale, the two must balance. Going to the land, we see that there's a projected 5.3% increase in precipitation, a 3.7% increase in evaporation, leading to a 9% increase in P minus C. Now, P minus C, precipitation minus evaporation, is obviously equal to runoff. So there should be, according to these models at least, an increase in runoff to rivers of about 21%. But The global figures, of course, don't help us understand impact all that much, because we need granularity. By that I mean we need to understand what's going to happen at a local scale. Now, previous research in 2006 by Held and Soden demonstrated that what appeared to be a relationship where wet sites got wetter and dry sites got drier. And this has caught the scientific public's attention, and it's caused a great deal of fear. More precisely, it was shown that the increase in P minus E, which is precipitation minus evaporation or runoff, was proportional to P minus E following Clausius-Clapeyron scaling. Clausius-Clapeyron is the relationship between saturated vapour pressure and temperature, and at the globe's average temperature, 1 degree increase causes a 7% increase in vapour pressure. Now, that result was obtained actually for projected changes averaged over latitudinal zones. Now, much of the subsequent research on impacts has been based on the implicit assumption that this Clausius-Clapeyron relationship also holds the local grid box scale. And so that's the question, this paper of Mike Roderick's, that we addressed. Now, here's a latitudinal distribution of precipitation and evaporation from the South Pole to the north. And you can see that the full lines were the results, the model results at present, if you like, and the dotted ones give the values in 100 years' time. And so the precipitation has increased, as has the evaporation. But as we can then plot the increase in P minus E versus a latitudinal band, and we can see that yes, there is a relationship, and this is the relationship that Held and Soden saw, and it falls pretty close to that dotted line, which is the predicted Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And so that's the basis of people saying that the wet get wetter, the dry get drier. However, if we plot those results instead of latitudinal bands, if we plot them as individual grid scale, you can see it's much more like a shotgun. And indeed, if we now look at the land alone, without the ocean, even at a latitudinal band scale, there really is no relationship between the change in runoff and existing degree of runoff. And when you go to the level of individual grid box, there's no sign of anything other than a shotgun. So the conclusion that the wet get wetter and the dry get drier is not supported at the local grid scale by the ensemble of models. And I might add that this is the same ensemble of models that the original work in 2006 was done, but as I said, that was done by averaging over different latitudinal bands. Nevertheless, the projections are for some areas to become drier, and these include some areas important to grain production, including Sonora here, and Central America, Chile, Southern Africa, the Mediterranean, possibly Southern Australia. So these are the ensemble average modeled projected changes in precipitation, and the ones that are green to blue are increases in precip, and the ones that are down this way are a reduction. And so you can see that in these Mediterranean area and then Central America, Chile, appear to be large losses of precipitation, and some losses in southern Australia, east of the Mediterranean, southern US, and so on. But I emphasize that these are projected changes in precipitation from models. How sure can we be about these projections? Well, I had a very salutary experience when I first became involved in models with general circulation models or global climate models. And this is some work I was involved with Leon Rothstein in CSIRO in Melbourne. And the graphs here show the annual trends for rainfall projected for a 45-year period from 1951 to 1996. And these 8 different graphs are just the result of eight different runs of the same model with slightly different starting conditions in 1870, slightly different conditions 100 years before this trend, this 45-year trend was modelled. And you can see they're vastly different. Now, these are not different for a single day or for a single year. We're talking about differences in trends for 50 years. Now, for a meteorologist, 50 years is already a climate. What this means is this is the butterfly effect on an enormous temporal and spatial scale. It says that small changes can change not only just weather, but small changes can change your appreciation of what the climate is over long periods. Well, switching away from modelled results to observations, what do we see? And remember that the CO2 has now gone from 280 to 400 ppm. And when you include the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, we've actually gone more than halfway to an effective doubling of CO2. It's a log 2 based system. So we've gone more than halfway. And what do the observations say? Well, here's the trends of the mean precipitation, annual precipitation, but expressed as millimetres per month. The trends are showed as millimetres per month per decade. And you can see that Mexico hasn't declined. And you can see that there's a big area of Africa that has had a decline in rainfall, but that wasn't on the projection. So one has to take these projections with a grain of salt. If you actually average out over the whole globe, the changes are very small. And they're shown here. So these are the grand mean rates of precipitation. And if you were optimistic, you would say that it's gone from 68.3 to 69.1, which would correspond to about a 10 millimetre change in global precipitation. But that's way less than the models would have predicted we should have had over that period. It should have been more like about 20 millimetres. But of course, there's jumping around which may be real, or it may be difficulties in measuring precipitation, because although it's quite easy to measure precipitation in a place like the Sonora Valley here, if you're in the New Zealand Alps or the Swiss Alps or equivalent areas where there's huge amounts of rainfall that varies over a short distance, rainfall is actually not that easy to measure. What about the variability in rainfall? We hear a lot about how the system has become much more variable. Well, these are data from the period 1940 to 2009, and it shows the trend of the temporal variance. As you'd expect, the largest variance was here in Africa, where the mean changed as well. There's also a lot of variance up through East Asia, and we think it may well correspond to places where there's lots of aerosols being added to the air. But anyway, the net sum is that temporal variance, average globally, has actually decreased. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to decrease everywhere, but it's just decreased on average across the globe. What this means is that on average, dry places have become wetter and wet places have become slightly drier. So it's the opposite of the commonly thought pattern. What about evaporative demand? The best measure we have is pan evaporation rate, and that's the pan as it used to be at the Bureau of Meteorology site at Canberra Airport. Around the world, pan evaporation rate has generally been decreasing, not increasing. And I think the important point to make is that global warming is not like a hot day. The reason I say that is that the oceans and the lakes warm also. They raise the humidity so that the vapor pressure deficit is less affected on average than if you just had a hot summer's day. The reasons for reduced evaporative demand include aerosol loading and global dimming, as we tend to call it, and reduced wind speed. Mike Roderick and colleagues, we showed a few years ago that in Australia at least, it's the reduced wind speed that is reducing the evaporative demand. That was first shown in Australia, but we found also that it was happening in the US, China, Tibetan Plateau of China, Italy, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. The only exception we found was in the Antarctic, and that probably is not an accident. We suspect that the circumpolar area of Antarctic has actually increased its wind speed. So, counter to what you tend to think, the evaporative demand around the world, the trend for the last few decades has actually been one of decrease. To what extent can we use responses to today's variation in temperature to learn about future changes in temperature? As I said, we should be about halfway there for the effect of a doubling. And for me, I can see parallels between what I know as a plant physiologist and working on photosynthesis and what I know working in climate change. For example, the effects of temperature on assimilation rate are different at different CO2 concentrations. As the CO2 concentration increases, the temperature optimum for photosynthesis increases. And we think we understand fairly well why that's the case. In the short term, if you're just looking at the effects of temperature and you're taking statistics from yield tables, you're going to see interfering correlations with less rainfall because, as I said, in the short term, a hot week or a hot few days is normally very dry, as distinct from the long-term changes that you get with climate change. And so the statistics on temperature effects on yield are going to have to be very carefully teased apart from those of its effects on water stress. I think the effects of increased temperature are important. As I mentioned, nearly all of the increase in long-wave radiation is matched by the outgoing radiation. That means that requires that temperature itself increase. And so there will be, if climate change works at all according to theory, there will be increases in temperature. And so understanding the effects on sterility or abortion need to be much better understood. I recommend the poster 132, and Shruti Narayanan can speak to that issue. I've got a note to myself here about photothermal quotient, that if you increase temperature, Howard Rawson pointed out, and Tony Fisher discusses it in his book, the need to increase the photosynthesis to sort of match the temperature side, and the idea that possibly that struck me was that it just happens that with the increase in temperature we're certainly going to get a big increase in CO2, so it works in the correct direction at least to keep the photothermal quotient to some extent homeostatic, or at least changing less than it would otherwise do. If we didn't have the increase in CO2-induced photosynthesis, we'd only be getting the increase in temperature. At the leaf level, doubling the CO2 concentration is effectively like almost doubling the rainfall. I say at the leaf level, that's an important distinction because how that plays out into a canopy and into a region is not at all clear. Nevertheless, I think for individual plants, it's safe to say that when the CO2 was only half its present value, say 20,000 years ago, the rainfall would only be half as effective as that rainfall, as the same rainfall would be today. I think that this helps explain trends in the sources and sinks of carbon dioxide. This is work of Corinne Le Carré and colleagues, and because they use the notation of atmosphericists, something positive means that it's something going into the air, something negative means it's coming out of the air. So a land sink will be taking CO2 out of the air, and you can see that there's been a steady increase in the rate at which CO2 is taken out of the air by the terrestrial sink. And it's probably the case, I suspect, that we've got more photosynthesis going on now than we've had probably for 100,000 years. So CO2 effect itself must be very strong compared to the negative effects that we will that any negative effects that have been occurring. That's not to say there can't be negative effects in the future, only that right now the biosphere is growing. We saw that also in work, once again, with a student or an ex-student of Mike Roderick, Randall Donoghue. This is work at CSIRO work using remote sensing and relating the changes in foliage cover in regions that are dry, in regions that are arid, and looking at how they respond to a change in rainfall. And over the period from 1982 to 2010, carbon dioxide increased 14%, and the responsiveness to foliage cover to precipitation increased by 11% in the driest regions. I'd like to leave some summary messages. Many of the projected difficulties associated with adjustment or adaptation to climate change are ones that farmers have faced before, but the projections add a layer of uncertainty. Increases in temperature place flowering at risk in many crops. This may require some crop production to move in polewards direction or to remain in place but with earlier sowing, or any of a number of things that innovative farmers and agronomists can sort out. But research is clearly needed on the mechanisms of heat stress. Research on water use efficiency. We just heard a lecture about the importance of water. That's obviously going to be important in rain-fed environments, and rain-fed environments may become, seem to me, likely to become more important. And we need to know how they'll change on CO2 concentration. We need to know the interaction between CO2 concentration and drought tolerance. And this is important for present-day problems, but it will be vital for future climates, particularly in the context of increased demand for water, just as will research on improvement of yield potential. There could be surprises, and an understanding of CO2, of carbon dioxide effects on, for example, photosynthesis, flowering, and plant-water relations in an ecological context would be good insurance. Thank you, Matthew.